On behalf of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi and the Trivedi Center for Political Data, Ashoka University, a very warm welcome to everyone for today's panel discussion on forecasting elections. For those who are joining us for the first time, the University of Chicago Center in Delhi is a hub for research, policy engagement, discussion, teaching among scholars in the university as well as worldwide. The Trivedi Center for Political Data aims at promoting data-driven research, policy work, and journalism on India's political life by producing and disseminating in open access, scientifically collected and treated political data. You will know more about the center when our panelists speak. To chair today's panel discussion, we have amongst us Professor Paul Stanildon, our own Paul. Paul is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and a non-resident scholar in the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His book, Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse, has won several awards. Paul has written and published extensively in academic and policy journals. The detailed introduction of Paul and our other panelists will be on the chat box, so do look out for it. Our panelists today, Gilles Verniers. Gilles is an assistant professor of political science at Ashoka University and co-director of the Trivedi Center for Political Data. He's a scholar and teacher on various aspects of Indian democracy and politics, currently co-editing a book on sociology of elected representatives in India. Our other distinguished panelist, Rahul Verma. Rahul is a fellow of the Center for Policy Research. He's also visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Ashoka University. Researched and published extensively on party politics, political violence, voting behavior, and media. Rahul stays connected with both policy and academics. He has co-authored a book with Pradeep Chibbar, which is on ideology and identity, the changing party system of India. So with this introduction, I would like to open up the panel discussion and invite Professor Paul Stanildon to chair the discussion. All ears, Paul, to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to thank the Delhi Center staff who do such a great job of putting on all of these events. But I especially also want to thank our panelists, who are two of the most, I think, thoughtful and data-driven young analysts and scholars of Indian politics who we have. So it's really my pleasure to introduce them. And I want to thank them for taking their time on this, what I'm sure is a busy evening for them to speak with us. I also want to make two plugs, one for each of them. First, Rahul's book, you should go buy, maybe buy 2 copies to help him out with the royalties. And then Gilles, the Trivedi Center is an incredible resource for political data. Go check out their website. They have all kinds of really user-friendly ways of accessing novel, rigorous empirical data. And so just two things I've particularly enjoyed about both of their work. So we're talking about forecasting Indian elections today. With state assembly elections coming up next year, this is going to be a major concern for scholars, analysts, journalists, citizens trying to make sense of what's happening in India's political landscape. As we all know, this is also a very vexed issue in which different polling companies and political prognosticators offer different predictions, try to give a sense of what's happening, sometimes doing very well, sometimes doing, one might generously say, less well. But this is an issue that occupies an enormous amount of kind of noise and headspace in the run-up to important elections. So the goal today is for me to stop talking, because this is not something I actually know anything about. I'm just going to be the moderator, but instead to give us a sense of what we should know about election forecasting, whether it makes sense, what polling looks like in India, how interested citizens should try to sort through different claims and different methods, and just to kind of get a better sense of this very important topic. So what we're going to do is ask each panelist to just give a few brief remarks, 7-8 minutes, on a particular topic that they think is really important to understand. And then I'm going to ask a few questions as we go along, but I'm hoping that Gilles and Rahul will kind of speak to each other as well in a more conversational format. So this is not like a dry academic seminar. Questions can be accumulated in the chat, and we'll do our best to get through them in the Q&A session. But we'll have to pick and choose for time reasons. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand it over. I think Gilles is going to go first, and then Rahul, and then we'll have kind of a conversation back and forth. So Gilles, all yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Lenny and Suman for hosting this conversation and for organizing it, and thank you very much, Paul, for calling me young. So the question that we have today is, why are elections in India so hard to predict? So obviously there are many possible answers to that question. Some have to do with the way surveys are themselves conducted, limitations on polling in India, both in terms of methodology, but also the lack of incentives to actually conduct scientific, transparent polling. I will actually leave most of these questions to Rahul, who has a far better knowledge of the internal mechanics of polling in India. But there are reasons also to think that the Indian electorate might be resistant to prediction, in the sense that you don't find many segments of voters many segments of voters do not display a consistent electoral behavior over time in between types of elections. So just to consider these three examples, in 2017, I took my class to Lucknow for the state assembly results, the UP elections. The day before the results, we were having kebabs in a popular joint, and we heard a local halwai complain that these elections had been bad for business. No one expected to win the next day, so no one placed any orders for sweets. Earlier that day, some BJP officers asked some of my students, why did you even bother to come from Delhi? This is going to be a hung assembly. No one's going to win tomorrow. There's nothing to see. And the next day, the BJP won 77% of the seats in an assembly of 403 with nearly 40% of the vote share. It was the biggest performance thrown by any party in UP since 1985. Second example. In the 2019 general elections, AAP, the party in power in Delhi, only scored 18% of vote share and did not win a single Lok Sabha seat in Delhi. And to be more precise, they did not even win a single assembly segment of Delhi in the state elections. But in the January 2020 elections, AAP scored 54% of vote share and won 63 of Delhi's 70 assembly seats. And the last example, the third example, in December 2018, the BJP lost 3 important state assembly elections in the Hindi belt, in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. The Congress won with some of its highest margins. The Congress won with higher margins in rural seats, areas that had been stirred by farmers' agitation for months. And so some of us, myself included, thought, that's it. Farmers are going to continue to mobilize, and that's going to bring a challenge to the BJP's domination in the Hindi belt in the incoming general election. So the farmers kept mobilizing. The issues did not go away. But 6 months later, the BJP swept these 3 states, and some of its highest victory margins were in the segments that they precisely had lost to Congress in the recent state elections. And these are not unusual examples. Work conducted on polling booth level by Pradeep Chibber and Francesca Jensenius shows that electoral volatility is also strong at the most granular level of participation, which is the polling booth. Polling booth over time produce different results in consecutive elections. And that's rather the norm rather than the exception. And so very clearly, there is a disconnect between electoral behavior in national and in state elections that indicates that people's votes may not be simply derived from their socio-demographic characteristics, such as caste or class or else. So predictive polling is based on the assumption that certain socio-demographic profiles or sociological attributes can act as predictors of electoral behavior. If you live in Bethesda outside Washington, if you drive a Prius, and if you send your kids to some leafy colleges of New England, you can safely predict that you vote blue. I was thinking of finding an example in Chicago, but I'm not as familiar with the geography. But we don't seem to have an equivalent in India. People seem to be at ease with voting for different parties across elections, across time. So what about caste? You might ask. Assumptions are, of course, made about the predictive character of caste voting. And electoral strategies remain by and large based on an exercise of ethnic head counting. How many Brahmins, Rajputs, Yadav in these seats, how many Jatav Dalits in that seats. Caste demography still very much informs ticket distribution of candidates, among other factors. But when we speak about caste voting, what we are actually talking about, it's a small number of large groups that consistently vote for the same party over a certain period of time. Yadavs with SP, upper caste with BJP, Jatav Dalits with BSP, and so forth. But there are only a certain number of states, a limited number of states, where you see large groups consistently voting for their party or for a party that they consider their own. Many states have large politically dominant groups, often agrarian intermediary caste, who split their votes between major parties, Marathas, Lingayats, Vokkaligas. Even sections of the Patels in Gujarat don't necessarily vote for the BJP. And even in the states where there are marked caste party alignments like Uttar Pradesh, the degree of cohesiveness of these core support bases is also fluctuating. Both SP and BSP have actually lost support among their core bases in recent elections, and they have won elections before that on their ability to get votes beyond their core support group. So rather than have caste voting, we have a limited number of fluctuating caste party alignments that do not even cover a majority of the electorate. And so most voters in India belong to groups that are too small, too poor, too geographically dispersed to matter politically in a collective sense. So today, the BJP succeeds in aggregating support from a large number of small marginalized groups by micro-targeting caste in different ways. It's currently good at that, it's effective, but that's not telling us how long it's going to last. These castes have supported the BJP cohesively in the past until they did not, right? And so they are better described as a floating electorate that currently does not find a lot of options other than the BJP in the electoral market. But this is for reasons that have to do with today's politics and not because of the tenets of some voting theory that tell us that according to X or Y variables, you can predict that X or Y caste is going to vote in a particular way. So we know that there is very little electoral stability with geography or with demography. But still, it informs electoral strategies, including the design of surveys that political consultative firms that have emerged over the past few years conduct very often on behalf of either media houses, but also on behalf of political parties. And if you take these surveys back to back, at least those for which data is available, that's another issue. And if you included only post-poll surveys that are believed to be more reliable than pre-poll surveys, you would see a lot of variations across types of respondents on the basis of class, caste, gender. So even if you could sort of figure out who's going to vote for whom, a few weeks in advance, the cumulative the accumulation of these surveys does not help you build a predictive model for not just the next election next month, but the next 2 or 3 elections, right? There are consistencies over time. We know upper caste are more prone to vote for the BJP. Elite segments of backward groups are more likely to vote for the BJP than poorer segments, but even that is changing. In 2019, the BJP progressed the most among the poorest Dalits. So that defies, the conventional understanding that we had about how Dalit votes in India. And so if the outcome is that electoral behavior is over time is volatile, that's not helping us to build a voting theory that we can use to predict electoral behavior. So in fairness, private pollsters are not trying to build a voting theory. They're trying to predict the next elections a few months and sometimes a few weeks in advance. But because of the ban on pre-poll voting, there's always a gap between the latest possible pre-poll and the actual results. And in between, a lot of things can happen and can also affect the results, right? In addition to volatility, we know that there are other factors that matter: campaign effects, exposure to information, including social media, last-minute deciders or fence sitters. And so we have survey data that shows us that these factors matter, but once again, we don't really know how to measure them in relation with one another, or even less, how to integrate them into a model of electoral prediction. And that's actually my cue, for Rahul, basically to say that a lot of polling in India seems to be conducted, I mean, beyond the methodological issue, they seem to be conducted on sociological assumptions that are actually quite fragile, that are also, changing, and that surveyors really assume and build their own model, design their own survey on. And so I always find that there's a big gap between the ability to conduct a survey, which for a number of players is actually very good, but the underlying sociology and that informs these exercise. And I find that quite lacking in many, many cases. So Rahul, that was my cue.
Great. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Paul. Thank you, Chicago Center and TCPD, Lenny, Suman, and everyone else. I have a tough task, and the task is tough because I'm going to basically walk a very fine line between my skeptic academic friends, political scientists, including Jill and others, about the world of polling and forecasting, and my friends in who are pollsters and whose bread and butter is basically polling and forecasting. So to begin with, forecasting and predicting is human nature. And we basically try to forecast, to predict not just election, but everything around us. You make investment decision, you make your saving decision, where you are going, what clothes to pack, weather forecast. So basically our life will not work without predictions and forecasting. That's my first submission. And so whenever you will have some information, you will always try to use that information to extrapolate on future. So, and so those who watch, say, cricket or football or anything, whenever a match is happening, just Google the name of the match, and by ball probability of which team is going to win, the winning forecasting keeps changing, right? So we will keep forecasting, as I said, is part of human nature, and it will keep happening. Second, and I absolutely agree with Jill on this, and we have talked a lot about this, which is that in India, we do not have a theory of how people vote. And the reason we don't have a theory of vote, it's not because that pollsters are doing a bad job of predicting election. Somehow academics like me and political scientists like me have in some ways failed to use, you can like discard all the survey information, but all other types of information that is existing, be it ethnographic fieldwork, be it, election data, the results. I don't know how much we have used that to create some sort of theory of voting in India. And in some ways, we can blame pollsters. So pollsters are academics or social scientists like us. They are always going to rely on some theories which we are coming up. And in some ways, the sociological way of understanding Indian elections have been created by us, not pollsters, right? So in some ways, it's a fault of academics like myself. Third point, and this is basically statistics 101, but none of the political science department, barring say Ashoka on upcoming private universities, none of the public universities in India have a single course on survey research, doing basic data analysis. So we don't even understand how the world of survey research and election forecasting work, right? At very basic level, for any forecasting is just about modeling uncertainty. It's not about on-dot predictions. So even if any pollster tells me that in past 10 elections, he or she has got his predictions right, I would say, yes, it was by fluke. You got it right. Every time, basically, forecasting is about creating some sort of ballpark range, and with some certainty. So in statistics, in social science, the standard sort of like measure is that if you have a 95% confidence, so you build confidence intervals around 95%, that I can with 95% confidence say that this party is going to get between X and Y vote share and between X and Y seat share. But no one has time for nuances, and especially the world of television, where everything has to be presented, like breaking news, and we've got projections and predictions right. So these are basically first three things to understand, the basics of why things are going wrong. Then there are a lot of complications, and at least like Paul, Jill, me, and everyone, many of you on the panel would share this, which is that the enterprise of election studies is not to predict election. We all are part of this to understand why people are voting the way they are voting, what is the status of institutions in this country, why people have faith in some systems and not have faith in other systems. So largely to understand the socio the economic status and democratic health of the country. Surveys are just one method of election studies enterprise, and forecasting is a very small part of this. So let's not basically reduce election forecasting to election studies. Now, the way all of this work is that you conduct survey. Surveys basically help you in estimating vote share of parties. And I'm basically reducing, like if you look at Lokniti CSDS election surveys, they are 10 pages long, and it will take anyone to at least 1 hour to fill that. So even if I'm going to reduce that, we are collecting 3-4 information, what surveys are basically doing? You are going to people, asking them which party they are going to vote. And then you basically use statistical models to convert that vote into seats. And the problem is that the whole focus gets reduced on predicting the seats, and we don't even talk about votes, which many of these pollsters get sometimes in the ballpark range. But no one wants to talk about the ballpark range. They all want to talk about on-dot prediction. That's basically, it's not consistent with statistics 101. Now, so there are two levels of problem. One, we might be failing in estimating the vote share correctly. And then the second problem is converting those votes into seats. Let me basically say why we get both these things wrong often. The 200 years worth of statistical theory is based on a very, very simple assumption that the underlying sample which you are using to estimate any parameter is based on a random sample. And that random sample is easy to say, but very, very hard to basically collect from the ground. What happens, and I don't think any pollster in India does random sampling. They have some variant of random sampling, and everyone wants to, why is random sampling important? Because random sampling ensures, if you have large enough random sample, it will ensure representativeness of the population in your sample. And that's really, really hard to get, because people reduce representativeness to, oh, we have X number of caste in our population, so that should be represented, gender should be represented. No, random sampling is also basically able to catch all the unobserved attributes. Even if people are not revealing true preferences, the assumption is that in a random sample, that will be randomly distributed. And so those will basically get canceled out. Random sample plus the size of your survey questionnaire determines the cost of the survey. To predict any assembly constituency with 95% certainty, you need a sample size of at least 800. Think of, if you're going to poll in UP, there are 400 assembly constituencies. And if you want to poll all those constituencies, you need a sample size of 320,000. And if you roughly estimate basically cost of one survey, and I'm telling by Indian standards, if Paul wants to do survey, the survey operators are going to cost him in dollars, and that would be much more. So it's basically a lot of money that is needed. And so what many of these survey agencies are doing, they are not basically picking up the random sample. So you are violating the very first assumption of how surveys work. Even if you say, I there may be some pollsters who are following random sample and they are being able to basically get their vote estimates right, or at least in the ballpark range. Then becomes the second problem, which is basically modeling the vote share into seat share. And we use, the most common method is to use what is called as uniform swing model. So in a way, if I have vote share of things, say UP 2017 assembly constituency wise, and I see party A gaining 5% over their votes in 2017 in 2022, I will basically use that information and say this will be randomly distributed, uniform swing. And so what would 5% additional votes would get into seats? Now, the base file of 2017, which you are using, has completely changed for 2022. The alliances have changed. They have new candidates that have entered, and Jill was pointing about some of those problems, right? Basically, volatility of political preferences, where people, change their votes at the last minute, or there is high electoral volatility. And then, even because parties don't have their votes uniformly distributed, what you end up seeing, and this has happened many times, including Karnataka, that the party which got highest vote share, which was Congress, got lesser seats than the BJP, which had got lower votes, right? So there is a high vote seat disproportionality built into the electoral system, which we have in India. Now, and I want to sort of wrap up, and then we can talk about other things during Q&A, is that it's not that these pollsters are not aware of these problems. It's not that many, there are bad pollsters, and I don't want to talk about it. I have a bad joke that if you if you go to a nice restaurant to get a nice food, why not go to a nice or good pollsters, credible pollsters, to look at election results? So let's not even talk about bad polling and bad pollsters. Even so, those who have good polling credibilities, they know all this information, right? And they have been trying to model many of these information in their models, but it's just things keep changing. And as in our world of social science, we basically keep chasing the goose. And the reason why I think, not because I want to get predictions right or elections right, why we must be doing predictions, because predictive models, not because of human nature. And Jill and Paul both would agree with me. If we don't keep doing predictions, not for predicting seats, but why people are voting the way they are voting, all we will end up doing is post hoc theorization. After the result, we will basically retrofit our theory, and that's why every time all the explanations are based on TV studios on three factors: factionalism, anti-incumbency, and this caste voted for that caste. And all three factors, most of the time, are constant. They don't change, but election results keep changing. Parties keep losing, candidates keep losing. Second, and this has happened not just in election studies, but also in security literature and other things. Predictive models is where basically there is some money on the line, right? And so what it has led over time, more sort of refinements of these methodological tools. And so I would say, yes, we are very far away from where we should be, but the answer to why things are going wrong is not that we stop it, but we have much more open conversations and discussions. The number crunchers should engage and sit with people who go on the field. Together, we develop a more robust theory of why people are voting the way they are voting. And that will also help us in making predictive models of why people vote the way they vote. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks to both of you. That was already really informative. Let me ask a question for kind of interested observers who are presented with a barrage of information in the run-up to an election, right? Both about survey results, but also the kind of translation of predicted vote shares into seat shares. How should we best assess the credibility, the informativeness, the quality of all of these different predictions that are flying at us in the run-up to these elections? What do you look for, even if you're not interested in specific forecasting, but kind of what makes a survey done well? What makes a claim seem more or less credible as kind of for those of us who just want to be educated about these matters. So what is the value of these, and where do we get the greatest value from, and what kinds of tactics, strategies, presentations should lead us to kind of downgrade the credibility of an assessment? So you either do.
And Jill, and I think Jill and I agree here on this, which is basically transparency. So revealing the methodological protocols that have been used to conduct the survey, sample size, representativeness of the sample, and other things, right? So more we know about how the data is collected, the better we will be able to make assessment. To any agency that has been not only doing sort of like regular surveys, but more credible surveys. And by credible, I don't mean getting everything right, but they have something more to their enterprise than just the election night forecasting, because then they are engaged in collection of lot more data. Now, how do I know about the credibility? So that's one part. But even when I look at these polls, I want to not only know, like, okay, if you got everything right, that's fair enough, but I know that's fluke. All I want to know whether, one, you are getting the direction right or not. That's the first. Second, even if you're getting the direction right, so in wave elections, that's very easy to predict. Everyone without doing survey knows who is leading. I also want to know whether you are able to capture some sort of differences between the winner and runner-up. Because unless you get the difference right, your forecasting model has some sort of problem. So I'll basically look at these three things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I would have, listed the same factors. I mean, the way you assess quality of a pollster, at least in India, it's certainly not just on the base of their past ability to get the outcome right. But in a way, there's a little bit of wishful thinking here, because I mean, we could talk about what an ideal, polling or an ideal survey would look like, in an ideal world. But in reality, there are no incentives for most pollsters to actually adhere to scientific norms that we social scientists consider as, pretty standard, including transparency, including making raw data available under anonymized condition, and so forth. Every pollster treat their method as a proprietary secret sauce. There is, I would suspect, a fear of transparency because it would expose the limitations and deficiencies of, some of these samples. As Rahul said, no one really does exactly random, sampling. But also the media is not, demanding any compliance to research ethical norms. They want to have, fancy numbers to throw at their viewers in a short period of time that separate the actual campaign and election and the actual results.
So I'd like to actually start drawing a little bit on some of the questions in the Q&A, because they're some of the same questions I had. So one of these is about, so Gilles argued we don't have a good theory of the Indian voter. Right. Now, I think in some ways that's true in a lot of places. In the United States, there's been a similar shift. What used to be the truisms about who votes for the Democrats are now changing, where now college-educated suburbanites are voting Democratic, which was kind of a Republican core constituency until not that long ago. So I guess one question is, how important is it to have, or is having a theory of voting the same as having a theory of voting over the next 10 years or the next 3 or 4 elections? So kind of what are we asking of a theory of politics here? And kind of what is the bar at which you would be more or less comfortable kind of as using this as a guide for generating these kinds of surveys and predictions? So I guess, Gilles, that's for you. Like, what do you want of a theory of voting?
So I think the use of a theory is, its ability to help us ideally ask the right questions, but also avoid asking questions on the basis of wrong assumptions, assumptions that are demonstrably false. A lot of the discourse that gets published around cast voting is based on plainly wrong or incomplete assumptions, right? And so also, the problem also is that a theory also should invite analysts to go beyond and looking at the next elections and maybe the previous one, but can help generate also information and data about a timeline of information, which is, I mean, forgive me for plugging TCPD here, which is precisely what we're trying to do, right? So I'll give you one example. So we have a project on individual incumbency where we try to measure the turnover of individual elected representatives in elected assemblies. And the numbers we had for recent elections was this: the turnover was huge, right? 50%, 60%, sometimes even 70% in UP and in many other states, which goes in the face of everything we know about incumbency theory in the US, in Europe, elsewhere, where there's always an assumption of incumbency advantage. But then when we look at the data over time, we see that it's been a constant feature, and that even when the Congress was dominant for 30 years in the first 3 decades, you still had a huge turnover of politicians, right? So that actually gives us theoretical insights about Indian politics. And maybe this extraordinary volatility we see is not the sign of an absence of theory, but maybe that's the theory, right? That, the Indian voters is resistant to prediction because one of the main driver is, using an election to express some form of discontent and keep changing, the way they vote. And so an electoral theory can be very useful if it helps us to ask us questions, but about a longer period of time rather than simply focus on the next election.
Great, thanks, Gilles. So there are kind of 2 types of questions I'm seeing that also I have. One is about surveys, polling, forecasting as a practice in an industry. Another is kind of what is the nature of the contemporary Indian electorate? So I'm going to pivot between the 2. So Rahul, I was wondering if you at least could lead off here. To what extent do you think the practice of surveys either is changing, is being used by parties, changes how candidates kind of think about what's happening in the electorate underneath them, and also potentially is changing how individuals, voters themselves, are maybe publicly speaking, right? Or kind of how they themselves are assessing what's going on in the electorate. So like, are surveys becoming sometimes, because they're publicized through the media, almost like an independent variable themselves, which could be driven by, media houses trying to get try to get attention, political parties trying to kind of get their narrative out through potentially dubious polls, kind of like, what is the practice of surveys and predictions, not as an outcome to be studied, but as a driver of other outcomes? Or is that an overblown concern?
Unmute.
Unmute, please. Sorry.
Sorry. So let me say a couple of things quickly on this. One, I think the question which Gilles was trying to answer is, we need a theory of vote because that would become the baseline to assess things. We would know more precisely why we are getting things wrong and where we are getting wrong. Right now, everything is an argument, everything is a theory, and everything is an hypothesis, right? So Gilles and I, between us, give us 30 minutes, we can list 100 reasons why polls might be getting wrong. If we had a good baseline of how Indians vote, we could have said, okay, these 10 factors matter more and 90 are just on the sides, right? So that's why we need some theory of vote. I would say, where I would sort of resist saying that, in the Indian case, volatility of political preferences are certainly higher than, say, United States. But it's not that all voters in India are basically changing their vote every time, right? Because Gilles himself argued that large caste, we know that this caste is voting for this party, right? And caste is not changing, meaning that we know a lot of voters in India, perhaps around 50 to 60%, are closely attached with political parties, but we have a larger size compared to US or other places, which is basically like the volatile group. And now we need to know why this group is volatile, right? Are they only changing their political preferences, or they're changing other things also? Because then most of our policies are based on survey data, NSSO, census, and other things, right? So then we are in a big problem. And that's why we need to study volatility of preferences, not just political preferences, and how stable they are. Now, on the question of surveys, I think, see, of course, on the margins, they must be making some differences. And political parties, political entrepreneurs, media, and everyone will be using some of this information to push their propaganda. Not just political parties, even people like us on social media, we push certain lines, right? And on social media, lots of journalists and other people, they come up with their predictions, right? Even when technically for election forecasting is banned and surveys can't be done, who's stopping you to say, I went to Jeel went to Lucknow, had kebabs, and I think this is what is going to happen, right? And so everyone is basically putting a lot of information. And my sense is that because this is like so much of information out there, I don't think anyone is basically changing the entire narrative or the election. What's happening in the political world, of course, in last 5 to 10 years, political parties are conducting their own in-house surveys, not just one, because I think they don't trust just one survey. So they get 2 to 3 pollsters to do their survey and just look at the, in fact, like I read a news, it was in Indian Express, that very recently PM was presented 3 surveys from UP with diametrically opposite findings, and he was very sort of irritated. So yes, like I think the world of polling is not doing a great job in what it's supposed to do. Perhaps they are doing cost cutting and other things, I don't know, or they are not well trained. But parties are using this information to choose their candidates. Candidates are using this information to basically decide where to put money and other things. So yes, it is getting a lot used. And so that's why you're beginning to see professionalization of election campaigns like US, but we are very far away, right? Like in India to become a West Wing kind of thing, the Netflix serial, it is like many decades from now.
Yeah, I was more thinking about Veep than that. But no, so what has changed is, so parties have relied on surveys for a long time. They used to call on basically foreign firms, the AC Nielsen of the world. And now what has grown is a, domestic industry of, private pollster who more or less, all have taken their cues from the first Obama campaign. Actually, I mean, you could write a history of how it grew and how people who used to work in the Obama campaign came to India, set up shop, or helped some of these shops to open and build up. As far as party polling is concerned, I mean, it's usually considered. I mean, I don't know if it's usually considered, but it's mostly a partisan exercise. So whatever parties have to tell about themselves has to be treated with the highest degree of suspicion, right? Because everyone is sort of pushing, an agenda. And so one good way to actually detect, the good from the bad ones is, do they have actually specific ties with specific political parties? Do they work for one particular party and not with others? Right, that's one thing that you can look at, if you want to assess the quality of pollsters. One major change is that all that business, which has been existing in India for a while, is now far more diversified and far more public. And because there are more and more people conducting survey, well, it creates more and more diversified outcome, which also ironically sort of exposes the limitation of the exercise, the way it is currently conceived and the way it is used for public consumptions. I would love to see the media use actually survey data to talk about issues like education, like healthcare, like what do people actually think about, what the state is doing, whether their lives have improved or not. But instead, the focus is almost obsessionally with, kitne seat, kitne kursi, and I mean, it's entertaining for a day and a half, in the lull between the last day of voting and the actual results, but it's of limited use.
So I'm trying to kind of combine different questions from the audience. I'm going to try to mix 2 together that may or may not work. But So several people have asked, do voters vote for parties or for candidates? And people have also asked about the link or difference between national level and state level elections. And I'm wondering if there's something going on here. So either or both of these questions, kind of how do we think about how voters are thinking about who or what they're voting for specifically? Does that vary between the national and the state level? And are there implications for how we understand these dynamics of polling and forecasting ahead of time?
So this is something related to the conversation you and Jill were having. Each of these two questions that were mentioned is basically will lead itself to mid-level theorization, right? What we in our social science literature. So we are talking about grand theory of Indian voting, but grand theory of Indian voting is very hard to come up. What we need is basically mid-level theorization on these questions. We have some information, we know some facts, right? We know that 1/3 of voters vote for the party, 1/3 of the voters vote for the candidate, and there is roughly 1/3 of the voters are voting for the leadership. This is what the 2014 and 2019 survey data from CSDS points out. Now, we don't know why that difference exists, right? Who are the people who are choosing party? Who are the people who are choosing candidate? Who are the people who are choosing leadership? And whether, so just to give you why we need lots of surveys. So when CSDS asked this question in 2009, they were only giving two options, party and candidate. So respondents were basically choosing between two things. Now in 2014, because Modi became important, so leadership also became the third item on the question, right? So now there was division. Think about it. If I add another option, then what will happen? Whether it will remain at 1/3 or something will remain at 1/3 or change. So what I'm saying that all of these questions, our understanding is so limited that we can't even begin to theorize at the mid-level to even sort of think about the grand theory.
Yeah, but we know that many voters, not all voters, but many voters have no issue voting for a regional party in the state assembly election and for the BJP in the national elections, or maybe another party, in the national elections. It's not perceived to be, as contradictory, behavior. The idea that electoral behavior is somewhat inscribed into who you are, that you have a stable party affiliation, translating into predictable. I mean that's just something that we do not observe. Not for every voter, as Rahul said before, but for many voters and for a number of voters large enough to mess up with or little predictive enterprise, or at least for those who are trying to do that.
So let me ask a question about non-response. There's a question in the Q&A that in the US case, there have been some really serious misfires with polling, a lot of which came down to basically there's a set of people who just don't want to respond to polls. And that is correlated with their voting preferences, but they're hard to get at precisely because you kind of can't see them. How does non-response work in Indian polling, and what should we make of it? Is this a systematic issue? Is it something that can be handled using standard statistical techniques? Is there a politics around it?
So let me try answering this question. Basically, forecasting goes wrong in a nutshell because of two errors. One is a sampling error and the other one is a modeling error. Now, this sampling error occurs mainly because of what you said, non-response bias and other things. And this also comes in many forms. So think of, there are three ways surveys are being done in India, right? Either you go in person, or you do it on phone, or you do it on internet. If you are doing it on internet and phone, you are systematically missing a large section of population which behaves very, very differently, right? Now, even when you are going in person, you might be not able to meet certain kind of people, poor who migrate, right? People, poor who does not have an off on the day you are doing your survey, right? So in a way, basically, there is a non-response bias built into most of our surveys, and there is a sampling error. You try to use statistical technique to basically minimize that error, but you don't overcome that completely. And so that's why in India, forecasting go wrong, because most elections, even when they are sort of one-way elections, are basically around 3%, 4%, 5%. Right? Think of UP. as Jill pointed out, BJP won 77% of the seats, and UP has 400 seats. 80 seats were decided with a 5% margin, right? And so 1/5 of the seat, if they're being decided by such a close margin, you will never get your seat shares right. Don't even try that.
Yeah. There are techniques also that you can, statistics that, surveyors use, which is, you try to always oversample the segments of the electorate that is the most difficult to reach, or the most likely to be among the non-respondents. So technically, you're supposed to oversample women, poorer voters, migrant voters, but precisely, I mean, they also happen to be the most difficult to reach. And to compound that, there's another factor that also intervene is, truthfulness in responses. Indian voters tend to be, Indian voters are very smart, they're well informed, they're pragmatists, but they also, healthily suspicious of, people from outside, asking questions. So my sense is, who are you voting for? Who did you vote for? Can be also biased by what is the appropriate answer. You can also ask that question to voters who belong to vulnerable groups, religious minorities or else, and they may be, reluctant to tell you. So the safest thing is to say, I'm undecided, I will decide at the last moment. And so maybe we are overestimating the number of fence sitters, the number of people who decide precisely for those reasons. But these are biases that are difficult to avoid.
And that's why random sample becomes of extreme importance. Because if you have a proper random sample at the end of the day, then all of these unobservable factors or errors associated with them will be randomly distributed.
Yeah.
And because you don't get random sample most of the time, those errors basically get multiplied and you have a bigger problem at hand.
But because it's a competitive market, which is partly linked to a form of, news and entertainment, there's also a rat race that prevents a lot of these pollsters to take this luxury of precautions. All of them ideally want to run, very quick phone surveys, 400 voters here, 400 voters there, and come up with very quick results. And the quicker, the more, the greater the possibility of actually, botching up the whole exercise.
So this is just kind of not a provocation, but if you could design one study or one survey or one kind of new novel way of studying, whether it's election forecasting or voter preferences, kind of if I gave you unlimited money to do something, what do you think would be kind of the biggest bang for the buck in getting at a question we don't understand well, or a topic that hasn't been studied properly, or one in which assumptions are often made, but about which we actually have no idea if there's anything remotely accurate about it? So what would be your kind of biggest bang for the buck, social science / electoral analysis study or project?
Thank you, Paul, for promising in front of 76 people that you are going to give me a lot of money to study elections. So, there are, and I think like the bottom line is that we have to leave our obsession with predicting elections. It should be done, but there are a lot of important questions, and you don't need a very large amount of money. Even with smaller focus surveys, we can start answering some of the questions that we discussed. For example, and I did this survey for very small amount of money in Delhi, where all I wanted to know, a very small question, which is whether people in the same household vote similarly. Do husband and wife in the household vote similarly? Do father and son vote similarly? Do siblings vote similarly? Think this question has not been answered in the Indian case. We don't have a single survey till date in India which has interviewed many members of the same household. And to tell you, like even in Delhi, which Jill pointed out, where Aam Aadmi Party got like more than 56% of vote share, even within the household, there were large differences. At least 1/3 of the household voted differently. And to my mind, why it was an important question, because the caste of and religion of the household is same. And if they are getting welfare benefits, they are getting at the household level. So something else must be happening inside the household, which is basically making them choose different parties. And so all of these smaller things, and as you know, national versus state election. So you interview the same person in a national election and state election and figure out why there is a divergence in the vote, right? So we need to do a lot of smaller focus study, and thank you for promising money. I will use that.
I'll be in touch with my bank account number. Don't, right after this, we can exchange information.
Excellent. Don't forget us also. Although, I mean, Rahul and I navigate in the same institutions, so it's fine. Yeah, no, I agree with Rahul that, we need more survey, we need larger sampling, we need better sampling. First and foremost, we need more transparency and accountability. It's very unlikely that one organization will able to, pull it through. In a way, Nate Silver in the US has built his success on the back of dozens of agencies who actually do a fine job or relatively fine job at, making those surveys. And he, merely, puts them together, draw a line in the middle and say, hey, come on. But so what we need is an ecosystem of actors, institutions, researchers, pollsters who contribute to not just an ecosystem of open data, but also contribute to an ecosystem of open data that creates the possibility of cumulative knowledge. I've written in a column recently that all the work done by pollsters, including the good work done by pollsters and survey organizations, does not amount to increase our cumulative knowledge about how people vote and how election, because it's all scattered, because it's proprietary. And because everybody hides behind proprietary models. So that would be definitely on my letter to Sandra.
That's great. So I think I think we are at an hour now. So first I wanted to thank the panelists. I think this has been a really educational, informative, and kind of fun exchange. I learned a lot from it, and I really appreciate your insights. I also want to thank the audience. This is one of the very few Zoom panels I've been on in which you didn't see the audience numbers just kind of plummet at some point, because I think there's been hopefully actual value added here. And I think that you can follow, or I know you can follow both Gilles and Rahul on social media. They publish extensively, so please keep an eye on their work. And so I've taken two broader kind of themes away from this. The first is this is a domain in which the public's preferences, consumers' preferences actually really matter because they're shaping the incentives. And so it's kind of up to you, the audience, as well, to kind of demand higher transparency, better rigor, and kind of maybe a less obsessive focus on forecasting versus understanding. And the second is kind of in line with Ashoka, with the Delhi Center. This is a realm in which social science really matters. Kind of thinking about theory and about method is central to what political parties should be doing, what the public should be asking for, what analysts, think tankers, academics should be doing. So it's an exciting place kind of where you see this intersection of what might seem like very traditionally academic scholarly concerns with actual real world politics. So I want to thank everybody again and wish you in India a good evening, and those of you in the United States a good morning, and also encourage you to kind of keep track of our panelists' research and public writings in the months and years to come. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. And this is only the first of a series of 4 discussions that we will be having on different political topics, or more news, more information about that very soon.
Yes,
Thank
that's right,
you,
Gilles.
everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.